me, I argue the reverse. On September 11, I could only think all that day, for some reasons, about Robert Forrestal, the Secretary of Defense of Truman, who kept warning about the consequences of America's recognition and support for Israel and its impact on America's standing among Arabs and Muslims for years and decades to come. So more root causes analysis, I think, is important politically, methodologically, and more. It seems to me without it, we cannot understand the context. I mean, somebody would say, you know, instead, they focus on the individuals. I mean, Peter Bergen yesterday was talking about, well, Muhammad Atta didn't go to madrasas, and he was from a privileged family. All that is true. But these people come from an environment. If you don't understand the environment in which from which they come, people will be able to provide Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and others with other recruits in the future. 7, there is clear inconsistency in the application of the definition. Pro-Western groups are scrutinized less than anti-American groups, even though all of them may perpetrate acts of terrorism. Cuban terrorism, of course, is a good example in terms of sentencing and prosecution in the United States. 8, the application of the Islamic or Arab label on terrorism by Arabs and Muslims, while there is no reason for it. I'm sure we would never hear the word Presbyterian terrorism, Jewish terrorism, Methodist terrorism, but yet people casually speak about Islamic terrorism. I think they want to do that in order to imply as if there is a particular brand of terrorism by Muslims, different from any other violence by any other groups. In reality, it seems to me Muslims are much less pioneers, much less original in the practice of violence. Just for remembrances, first, I mean, and you can find this information, many of them in mainstream sources, including mainstream Zionist sources like Walter Lacquer's A History of Zionism. First bombs in cafes in the Arab-Israeli conflict were not thrown by Palestinians, but by Zionist groups on March 17, 1937 in Jaffa. First bombs on buses were not by Palestinians first, from August to September in 1937 by Zionist groups. Bombs in markets were not first originated by Hamas, by Zionist group, July 6, 1938 in Haifa. Bombs in hotel were not pioneered by Palestinians, July 22, 1946 in Jerusalem by Zionist groups. Bombs of embassy, October 1, 1946 in Rome by Zionist groups. Ambulances, October 31, 1946 in Petah Tikva. Letter bombs were first used in the Arab-Israeli conflict by Zionist groups in 1947 June in Britain against British targets throughout the United Kingdom. 9, the employment of standards that are not based on the equality of human life in the evaluation of terrorist acts. Terrorist acts are judged with tremendous regard to the nationality, religion, ethnicity of the victims as well as of the killers. So less expensive humans, like Arabs or Muslims, gets much less attention and count as victims. Conversely, acts of terrorism by non-Arabs and non-Muslims, by Western groups, whether American troops in Afghanistan or Iraq, who continue to kill civilians regularly in the name of fighting terrorism, or Israeli acts of violence against Palestinians, do not get the attention or the label that violence by Arabs receive. 10, the treatment of suicide bombings as uniquely Islamic phenomenon or as a form of political violence as if different from other forms. Here, I think Robert Page did the most effective job in dispelling that, so I won't elaborate. 11, the exaggeration of the political significance of groups that perpetrate spectacular terrorist acts. Here, my message is to Middle East experts, not to the general audiences. I think it is incumbent on us to resist the popular culture and political culture's pressures to treat insignificant groups, politically speaking, like Al-Qaeda, like, say, Abu Nidal's group in the past, as if they speak for Islamic or public opinion. I mean, this is why the Islamo-fascist label absolutely does not apply, and this is why all calls for jihad by Bin Laden and others have fallen on deaf Muslim ears. And this is why the whole membership of Al-Qaeda can fit in a room or amphitheater or cave or two no more. And this is why what Hannah Arendt wrote in Origins of Totalitarian will convince you that that term does not apply to these groups and movements. These are insignificant groups, even though they may be able to commit spectacular acts of violence. The one anarchist who killed President McKinley, I mean, that was a spectacular act. Doesn't mean that anarchism was a vibrant movement in the United States and people were studying at the time. I think there are many political movements that have nothing to do with terrorism or Al-Qaeda that needs much more attention than they receive. 12, it is often forgotten that groups that commit terrorism emulate terrorist methods and modes of action of their enemies, whether Palestinians in Palestine for their struggle, and whether Iraqis against Americans in Iraq or in Afghanistan. 13, it is rarely questioned as to why the United States should be an objective arbiter as to decide what is terrorism and what is not, especially when, A, the definition of terrorism by the United States has been clearly moving at fast pace and changing. So now, it used to be, when I first came to this country, it was targeting of civilians for political reasons. Now, I mean, anybody who targets, I guess, the expensive humans, you know, Westerners or Israelis, even if they are armed combatants, that person will be regarded as terrorist and the act will be regarded as terrorism. Now, of course, it is true, there is victimhood from September 11. Absolutely. But this victimhood is not unique. I mean, September 11 is not unique to the life of humans. I mean, of course, this was a horrific act that was visited upon the United States, but the United States visits September 11 on the lives of other people regularly. If you sanction American and ending wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and Somalia and elsewhere in the region, in proxy or directly, you will then give permission to all the Muslim and Arab victims of American and Israeli bombs to do the same, and I'm sure you wouldn't. So one has to be careful about what sanction you give to the United States in response to September 11. Israel has visited much more than a September 11 on Lebanon in the last war. In the last war, Israel's war on Lebanon, 1,200 Lebanese were killed. And an overwhelming majority of them were civilians. Hezbollah killed 140-something of Israelis. Overwhelmingly, they were military. And yet, if you want to consider Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, which you may, you certainly have to consider applying that label to Israel, which at least in that confrontation killed more civilians of the other side than vice versa. Otherwise, I mean, there is a problem of terminology, or more, ideology. 14, I think we have to speak about what Edward Herman called the terrorism industry. The extent to which the terrorism industry and the funding of terrorism industry, its links to government, is affecting the production of that industry. 15, why is the pursuit of terrorists and terrorism in all forms and manners is justified when it kills as many innocent civilians as terrorists do? And what if we reach a point when the pursuit of fight against terrorism or pursuit of terrorists can equally be considered a terrorist act if it kills as many civilians as terrorists do? Finally, I think terrorism doesn't seem to be going away as long as there is a consensus in favor of violence internationally. The only difference is that people who practice violence, they never call it terrorism, consider their violence sanctioned and praiseworthy, and they consider the violence against them very much terrorism. This is very much like the theologians who used to argue about what is considered to be just war. Thank you for listening.
Please.
Okay. Hi. My name is Mia Bloom. I'm a professor at the University of Georgia. I wanted to ask Dr. AbuKhalil, which I thought the presentation was very interesting, but I also wanted to maybe push you on one or two issues regarding the use of violence. I think that it's not untrue that there has been a focus on violence, in part sometimes maybe because that's where the money is, with the creation of these Department of Homeland Security $12 million centers. Terrorism, which was not particularly interesting for a decade, all of a sudden became interesting because professors, universities, and others saw the entrepreneurial aspect to it. But this is where I'm going to caution you. I worked very closely 15 years ago with an Israeli professor named Ehud Sprinzak, who wrote extensively on Jewish terrorism. I work on not just Islamic terrorism, but a comparison of Islamic terrorism with non-Islamic terrorism. But I would say that if you were to go to any Boston bookstore, the IRA section would be very impressive as well. So that this is where I'm not disagreeing with the very strange focus, and maybe some of our priorities have shifted. Be that as it may, I was hoping maybe you could comment then as well on the growth of what seems to be legitimation within Islamic, either fiqh or Islamic specific leaders, to acknowledge and allow sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia.
I mean, there's more than one question in that interesting question, which is okay with me. Several things. On the question of funding, I think there is certainly a motive of profit for people who want to pursue certain careers or dissertations, and there's more funding for certain topics than others. I don't believe it's new. I think it has always existed since when I came to this country 23 years ago. I think there is much more of it than before. Yes, there are people who study Jewish terrorism, and Ehud Sprinzak is one of them, and you and I know of his work, and I wonder how many others do. Certainly the ones who do that don't get as much attention, don't get as much coverage as the ones who do Muslim terrorism. But most importantly, what do acts of Jewish terrorism lead to? Do they trigger wars against them? Do countries mobilize? Does the Security Council meet over the issue? Is it the same kind of renunciation that an act of violence lead to by a Palestinian against Israel? I mean, one time there was an act of violence, terrorism by my standards, against civilians in Israel by Hamas or Islamic Jihad that prompted the US president to go to Israel to show his sympathy. I mean, again, how many Arabs have to die for one show of sympathy to be exhibited on the part of any American official? So certainly there's an imbalance, even if there are some people here and there doing that. The last part of your question is about whether the legitimization for violence. Universally there is, yes. I disagree that this is something peculiar to Muslims or to Arabs. I mean, the Afghanistan war was supported by 93% of the American population. 93%. And, well, of course, it's justified for many Americans. I mean, 93% of them. But what is the reality of that war? According to U.S. Central Command figures, up to March of 2003, we don't have the figures after, I don't have the figures afterwards, something like 22,400 bombs and missiles were dropped on Afghanistan. But they bragged that the technology of warfare has improved, so a mere 25% only missed their targets. Hundreds of bombs and missiles missed their targets. In the Iraq War of 1991, according to Navy figures quoted in Rick Atkinson, no lefty source, Washington Post reporter, in his book Crusade, in the 1991 war, up until February of 91, something like 88,000 tons of bombs and missiles were dropped on Iraq. According to Navy figures, more than 70% of them missed their targets. So, I mean, and yet, these are popular war. So, is there a difference between legitimization of acts of violence by Arab groups or legitimization of acts of violence by American groups? For me, I mean, if you measure it by the amount of people killed, I mean, certainly, a lot of people have been killed in Afghanistan and more than any other place in Iraq as a result of American war and occupation.
Yes, sir.
Robert Iguchi, this war on terrorism started when the war on communism ended. Did the political leaders in this country need a new war? Is the dog wagging the tail or the tail wagging the dog?
Could you direct the question to the panelists?
Just the whole panel.
Would anyone like to address that? No. Yes.